Hello YouTubers, it is of course me, Trollface the Man, and welcome back to another Patreon early release video. A series of videos I released to my Patreons a couple of days before their public release. Today we are looking at something that is kind of interesting, and pretty cheap for what you are getting, supposing that it actually works. What this is a $5 Tesla Coil Kit you can buy from eBay, and this is $5 with shipping. So it comes in a package much like this, just a baggie of parts, and the whole gimmick of this is that you assemble it yourself. This thing is kind of amazing because not just being a Tesla coil, a desktop-sized Tesla coil, it has an audio jack so that way you can play music through it. But the real question is, does it work? So this is one that I had already bought and assembled as a practice to do this video. In this video, we're actually going to assemble this thing from start to finish to show you what the process is, and basically you can judge yourself whether or not you want to pick one of these up and give it a try. There's a couple of things you need to keep in mind though if you do decide to get a kit like this. Though it might seem straightforward, they don't come with any instructions. Most of the things are actually labeled here on the circuit board. So if I pull out this circuit board here and I show you, you should be able to see that it'll tell you like where the LEDs and where the resistors and all the other different stuff goes. So a lot of the stuff is pretty straightforward, but there are a few things that might be a little bit confusing, such as right here, they kind of just show a bridge, typically meaning you'd bridge a wire straight across here, but instead, in this situation, you're actually supposed to make a coil around, a primary coil around the secondary coil that steps up the voltage significantly. So, yeah, let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to keep in mind is this is $5, it doesn't come with a power supply. So you're going to have to get your own power supply or have one laying around. The second thing is though it might seem like you probably just need solder to complete this kit, solder and a soldering iron, that's also not the case. Soldering iron is going to be important, solder is going to be important, but there's a few other things that are crucial that you may or may not have lying around. One of the things that everyone will probably have lying around is a screwdriver. The other thing most people probably will have lying around is some form of snips, and if not, you can pick one of these up from the dollar store. The thing you'll also need, but most people won't have lying around unless they work with computers or they commonly work with LEDs and electronics, is thermal paste of some kind. And the reason why this is important is because we actually need that to form a nice connection between the transistors and the heat sinks that they have. They don't provide any thermal paste, so if you just mount these directly to these heat sinks, I can guarantee you they are not going to last very long at all. So thermal paste, snips, screwdriver, soldering iron, solder, and the other one is a hot glue gun or some type of epoxy or something. You're going to need that to stick down this coil. Alright, so let's get started then. I think the best place to start is with the resistors. We have 10K, 10K, and 10K, and then we have one 2K resistor. Even if you can't read resistor color bands or you don't have a multimeter to check the resistance of the resistors, this is made pretty simple because we have 3 of one type of resistor and then 1 of another. So we have the 3 10K resistors that came with the kit right here, and then we have the 1 2K resistor right here. There's no polarity that you need to worry about with resistors, so we can literally just pop them in any orientation. So starting with this 2K resistor, I'm gonna very carefully bend the ends here. These appear to be 1/8 watt resistors. I'm gonna take the holes for the 2K. I'm gonna zoom out a little bit because it looks like I'm losing some sharpness. I'm gonna take the holes for the 2K resistor and just line them up with the leads here. Push them right through till they're tight with the board. Now they might hold in through friction, or they might kind of bob up and down and want to fall out when you flip it over. So what I like to do a lot of times is just take the leads, not very close to the board, a little farther up, and then just twist them like this, and it will usually hold them in place in preparation for soldering. And instead of just soldering one of them at a time, I think I'm just going to stick in these other three using the same exact method. I'm also going to plug in my soldering iron in preparation to solder these. So that's the 2K resistor in. Bend the leads down for these ones too. 10K right in the center here. Same thing, I'm going to take these leads, twist them, just kind of give them lock them in place, ready to be soldered. These heat sinks you'll probably want to solder last, because if you put them right here, for example, you wouldn't be able to get at this resistor very well at all. You still technically should be able to with the long leads, but just a lot of times heat sinks and bulkier things will get in the way of your work. So another one in. And last one goes right here. So I want to say I'm not an expert on Tesla coils. I do know a fair bit about most electronics, but not everything. So I'm just going to say, if I say something stupid during this video, I apologize. It's very, very likely, because like I said, I don't know everything about Tesla coils and everything about every electronics ever. Oops. Messed that up. But for the most part, hopefully what I say won't be too idiotic. I'm assuming, based on how this looks like it works, it's a basic Slayer exciter circuit where basically you have a transistor that turns on and off really, really quickly, creating a high frequency alternating current by using forward bias of the LEDs. And I mean, you can get, if you look up Slayer exciter circuit, you can get a lot better info than me babbling on about it. But like I said, that's what it looks to likely be, in my opinion. These resistors are holding in place well. They should lay pretty flat, so I think we're just going to solder those for right now. Alright. Now I lost my other tip, my finer tip for my soldering iron, so I'm going to actually be using a quite bulky anvil tip, but or flat tip, but it should still work just fine. So I am touching the solder to the pad, and then I am touching the stem of the resistor and the pad at the same time with the soldering iron, so that way the solder takes. Looks like that made a good solder point. I think this is likely a lead-based solder, and it seems this I found in my friend's garage when he left his house, and he said I could just take whatever in there. And I'm not even sure if it originally had flux built into it, but if it did, the flux has gone bad, because by itself it doesn't actually want to take to a joint very well. So what I do is, off camera, I dip it in flux, just the end in flux, before soldering, and it still works fine. So I just got a big thing of electronic flux over here. Now you want to be very careful, like for example right here. You have to be extra careful you don't manage to bridge this solder point with like this runner here or anything else like that. if you do, you might have a bad time, and you'll likely need desoldering wick in order to break the connection. Most of the stuff on the circuit is very, very simple though, and quite forgiving. So we have these nasty looking leads hanging off. Everything seems to be soldered in place well. I'm just going to take, these are cheap snips. I don't know what happened to my good snips. They're around here somewhere, but I don't want to find them. We're just going to cut off these excess leads. There we go. Much better. Doesn't actually look half bad. Now the cheap snips kind of leave like a sharp edge a lot of times. Once again, better snips tend not to do that. What next should we do? I think we should do the LEDs. Now this is the first thing that you have to be sure you put in the right orientation. So we have an LED here, and it says positive, if you can see that. Positive this way, negative this way. And normally what happens with LEDs is the longer lead will be the positive. The longer lead will be the positive and the shorter one will be the negative. But getting LEDs from China, it's always a good idea to check. So I have a button cell battery here. I'm going to put the positive on the supposed positive side and then the negative on the negative side. Okay, it looks like the polarity is correct. Once again, never take it for granted, because sometimes things will from China aren't always the right way. So I'm just going to slide that through there. Doesn't really pressure fit very well, so it will just kind of fall back out. However, I think, and this is the same orientation, positive this way, negative down. These are the two LEDs we need. Getting them the right polarity. I think if we just kind of pull them through like this and then let them sit against the desk like that, I think that they'll hold themselves in place. So giving them a little solder. Once again, touching the stem of the LED and the pad at the same time. Now I'm not going to solder both of these at once. I'm going to go from soldering one side on that one to one side on this one, and then back to the first one. Come on, there we go. And now back to the second one. And the reasoning behind this is I don't want to solder too long on one of them, because that could potentially damage the LED. But surprisingly, they actually turned out pretty good. This one looks a little wonky. I'm gonna touch that one again. So for this, I'm just going to touch both pads at once and then straighten up the LED here. Okay, I think that should be straight. There's many different ways to do that. You could just hold it, you could do whatever, but it's straight enough for this purpose. And then we can just take these leads and then nice little snip again. Flinging the metal leads all around the room for me to find with my bare feet later when they stab me in them. What else can we do right now? Okay, we have a non-polarized capacitor here. I imagine this is probably ceramic film or some other type of film based capacitor. And we have a spot right here for just that capacitor. You can see it's just two plates. The symbol is just two plates close to each other, which is essentially what the capacitor is. So I'm going to slide that in. Oops. Now little kits like this are great for people that want to start learning how to solder boards, but don't quite feel comfortable just buying some breadboard and then putting pieces together. This just kind of teaches you basic soldering abilities and just can be a good starting point. So I'll push this down, and it looks like it pressure fits pretty well. So once again, being non-polarized, we don't have to make sure it is facing a specific direction, unlike the LEDs, which you do. Get that a little solder. Looks like we have a ball there because we didn't have enough flux. Get rid of that. Point looks good. Snippy snip. Snip, snip. That capacitor's in. We have another capacitor put in. This one, however, is different. This is an electrolytic capacitor. They have a polarity, meaning they need to go in a specific way. If you don't put them in the right way, then likely you are going to get a explosion and potentially fire, or in the least, you'll just destroy the capacitor. We can see that there is a capacitor spot right here, 10 microfarad, and on one side of it, it shows solid white, and on the other side, it is just a circle, and it's the same color as the board. The solid white side, half, should represent the negative side of the capacitor. You can see the negative side with this white band, and then the other one that isn't that solid white should be the positive side. Once again, looking at this, the negative side has the shorter lead and the positive side has the longer lead. So lining up the negative side with the solid white half, and then the positive side with the positive side, of course. And once again, this is very important because these capacitors are polarized. We can solder this in place. Building circuits like this can be quite relaxing too if you're just looking for a hobby, kind of a therapeutic. You know, it takes a little time out of your day, but it's fun to kind of construct something from hand. So let me clean off the bit a little bit. That's just a cheapy soldering iron I got from Home Depot. I think the thing cost $10 if even. So it's not the best, but it works. Okay, this is all the parts we still have remaining. I'd like to point out they do give you some extra parts with this kit. They give you an extra LED, and they give you 2 extra screws, so don't be super worried if you find out you have extra components. I think the next best thing to probably do would be the, I probably should have done this before, but this audio input here. So I'm going to just line that up. And pop it through. Perfect. I'll solder this in place too. A little flux. Once again, every time I go off the screen, I'm just getting a little flux on the solder. Got a hair on my hand, apparently. Pulled that off. This one is probably the trickiest component I found on this board to solder in place. It's the input here. Now, before you solder this into place, you'll probably want to take note of this. If you don't, you can find it on the product page. But when you put this in place, you can't actually see, oops, because it doesn't show you on the back side, which side is supposed to be the voltage input and the ground. Usually the ground will be the outside and the voltage input will be the center pin, but some power supplies, the polarity will be flopped. Or excuse me, the polarity will be flipped. And that means potentially, because this doesn't seem like it has a, diode in here to protect anything, unless maybe these LEDs can do it, but I don't think so. Wrong polarity could potentially destroy the circuit, especially with the electrolytic capacitor. So you have to make sure that whatever power supply you use, this center pin is going to be the positive, and then the outside is going to be the ground. And it seems as if that this side right here and this one, which on the back are these two, are commonly grounded. You can see a little connection on the top. So both ground, and then positive right here. Or excuse me, ground, ground, then positive right here. That's my bad. So ground, ground, positive. Common ground, positive. So the reason why this one is so hard to solder in is because there's so much play to it. You can see how much it wiggles around and moves. So it's very easy to solder it because you can actually solder it on pretty crooked. So I think the best way to do this is to hold it, try and push in as much as possible in one direction. So I'm pushing all the way to this side, and then solder it in place like that. This is tricky though, because you practically need 3 hands to do it, or at least some ingenuity. So a lot of times I'll wrap solder around my finger like this and line it up like so. Maybe a little extra flux on here. I can see that this one, I didn't solder it on very straight. So I'm going to take it real quick and remelt that joint, because it already has solder on it, and just try and straighten it out a little bit. Sorry. Just remelting the solder that I already applied and straighten out the plug a little bit. Okay. It's not too bad. I think it's good enough for this. So let's hit those other joints. And don't worry about making, like, just plastering the thing with solder right in the beginning. It's good to have plenty of solder on these because the input will probably take most of the abuse. But like I said, on your first joint, if you keep trying to add more solder, you're probably going to shift stuff around. So solder all 3 of the joints first, then go back to your first one, which might not have adequate solder to it, and then hit that with a little extra solder and flux to make sure it flows on nice and smooth. So this is the board so far. We're getting pretty close, because that was the worst component, if you ask me, to have to deal with soldering on. The only other things we actually need to solder is the wire, which will be the primary coil, and then these transistors. They might look the same, but they are very, very much different. One of them is the P75N75, and the other one is the B243C. So they perform different functions. One of them is going to be basically the circuit exciter, and the other one seems to be for the audio, basically audio manipulation of the Tesla coil. Luckily, they label right here what transistor you need. So you see this is B2 or BD243, and this is P75 and NF75. Sorry guys, I have dyslexia. Sometimes it's really hard for me to read, especially if it's a bunch of numbers and letters really close together. So P75 NF75. So we just match this. This one right here is the BD. So we know it goes on this side, and then the other one is the P7, so we know it goes on this side. Do not put this in and then solder it in place before attaching it to the heatsink, because you're going to have a really bad time. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your heatsink here. This is a very important step unless you want your transistor to burn out very quickly. Luckily, these heatsinks can go either way, so you don't have to worry about which side you mount it on. You're going to take a little bit of thermal paste. This could be any type of thermal paste made for electronics, and I find that computer thermal paste works well too. I'm going to put a little dab here. That was probably way too much, but and you're going to press it to this heatsink, and this allows the transistor's heat that's generated to transfer to the heatsink much better. If you don't have this here, they're going to overheat and burn up probably pretty dang quick. Then all these screws seem to be, for this kit at least, the same threading. So you can just grab any one of these screws. Dang it. Yeah, I put way too much goop on there. And then you're just going to screw it nice and tight to this heatsink, making sure that it stays fairly straight. Like I said, I put too much goop on here, but it should be fine. As long as you make sure you hit enough pressure there to kind of squeeze it out as best as possible. So we are going to want to line up the different transistors to the appropriate side. So this is the BD side. And you see, now that you attached it to this heatsink, you should just be able to line up all the holes. And now you can solder on the heatsink and the transistor at the same time, instead of soldering on the heatsink, then mounting the transistor, or so on and so forth. Instead of soldering one of these at a time, though, I think I'll get both of these ready and do them both at the same time, because it's just a smarter way of doing it. So once again, we're going to use a little bit of goop on the back of this transistor. This time a lot less. I say that, but I put on almost the same amount. Line up the hole here. Take a screw. Screw it into place. Which always is much easier said than it is done, because the screw wants to flop around. Okay, yep, I got it. So just screwing it into place. And making sure it's pretty tight and straight. Oops. Actually just loosened it when I did that. Okay. So by taking this, checking once again just to be sure, always check P7, 5. So this goes on this side. Pop it in place. Perfect. And then this one is the BD, and it's going to pop in this side. And because we have both these heat sinks, and this is why I said for you to make sure you solder in the resistor before putting on these heat sinks, because that center resistor in there is going to be pretty hard to get at otherwise. With both of these on, you literally can just stand it up like this and then solder it very, very easily from the back. So I'm going to solder the heat sinks first. And for this, you're probably going to want a good amount of solder on this bottom pad, because these actually help the heat sinks dissipate a little extra heat through the board. The better the connection you have with the board, the more the board can also act as a partial dissipation for the heat sinks. Just making the circuit potentially run a little bit cooler. Checking to make sure. Looks like there might have not have been a completely clean solder on this side, so I'm going to add a little bit more. Okay, I think that's just flux there. And now we're going to solder on the transistor leads. This one wicked down the tracer a little bit, not too bad. Clean off my iron again. And I think we're good. And now I technically could cut off these transistor leads with the snips that I have, but for this specifically, I like leaving them on just in case I ever need to pull this transistor out for some reason. Like, let's say, for example, remounting new thermal paste, it'll make it easier to put back in versus if I cut them super flush. And because we actually have, what this is pretty cool, they include with the circuit standoffs that will be, mounted almost as legs. It'll keep the circuit high enough off the ground that those leads won't be hitting on stuff and rocking around, so it's not too concerning. All right, the last component we need to mount is going to be, well, technically not the last component because we also have the secondary coil, but we're going to need to mount this primary coil. solder to the board, and then there's a little tiny wire from the secondary we need to solder. This is something that is a little perplexing though, because you have to specifically, there's no solder, there's nothing you can solder, like leads you can solder the secondary coil to the board with. So instead, you have to glue it some way. I found hot glue works, but there's also an issue that this circuit can run hot with these transistors, and it actually can run hot enough to cause the hot glue to melt close to it, which I'm hoping by doing a quick fan modification, I can alleviate that, but we will see. So I'm heating up my hot glue gun right now. In the meanwhile, like I said, even though this shows a straight line between these 2 points, which would indicate that you're supposed to solder it basically like this, you're actually going to be wrapping it around the secondary coil like so. That's going to be right here in the middle. So just keep that in mind. I actually stupidly soldered it straight across, not paying attention, and then I realized my mistake. I didn't have enough wire of their wire to actually successfully complete the coil, and though I had plenty of wire lying around, the wire that I had was too big to fit through these tiny little holes. If that does happen to you, don't worry too much. What you can do is you can just wrap it around and solder it to the bottom using these leads, as I've done with this coil. You can see this one's kind of rocking back and forth, and that's because it's gotten so hot that it melted the hot glue, as I said. So a heat-resistant epoxy would probably be a better idea, or something similar. But like I said, I hope by mounting a fan to these heat sinks that I'll be able to keep it cool enough that it doesn't cause the hot glue to melt like that. But yeah, so you can just solder it to the bottom if you have too thick a wire to fit through the leads. Simple alternative. I think the best thing to do is for me to mount the secondary coil first, so that way I can see better how to wrap the primary around it. Now this is quite simple. The way the circuit actually works is you have a high frequency alternating current generated by the, like I said, I assume this is a Slayer circuit. It induces a primary AC current in this primary coil, or it pushes a primary AC current through this primary coil, and which is wrapped around the secondary coil. The alternating current induces a secondary current in the secondary coil and steps up the voltage proportional to turns. So the turn ratio. So if this, for example, wraps around once and this were to have 10 turns in it, it would multiply it by 10 times. If this wraps around once and this has 1,000 turns in it, it'll multiply it by 1,000 times. It's just a very simple way to step up the voltage. And I'm not actually sure how many turns this has in it. It looks like quite a bit. Yeah, I wouldn't even be able to take a guess. I mean, I would think maybe 1,000. It's super thin wire, but man, I just do not know. I cannot tell you. So I'm just waiting for my hot glue gun over here to warm up so I can glue this down. So I'm going to pause the video for a second while that warms up. All right, so the hot glue gun is sufficiently heated. Basically, I'm going to glue the coil down right here, being very sure that this wire that comes off of it, which needs to be soldered on, is lined up with this hole, at least pretty close. So once again, just going to hot glue it like that. Have to act pretty quickly. I'm going to put a decent amount of hot glue like this, which, like I said, because the circuit gets pretty hot while running, doesn't like staying the best. Then lining that up, push it on like this. Don't worry about getting the wire through the hole right now. What we mainly want to worry about is just making sure that it's close enough that you can get it through said hole. And it's already stuck on because the circuit board helped carry away some of the heat because of its conductivity. Take that thin wire, just about as easy as threading a piece of string through a needle. I have it through the back now, and normally what you would do is you would take sandpaper or a lighter or something like that and clean off the insulating barrier, the pinkish orangish looking barrier that is on these wires. That way they don't just short circuit all the way through. But because we're soldering it, we're using flux and stuff, I'm not super concerned about it. It should get melted off or burn off during the soldering process. So I am just going to solder like so, like I normally would. Oops, the solder doesn't just roll away, not wanting to take to the pad. There we go. Use a little bit more. It doesn't seem like it wants to, because that insulating barrier doesn't want to go completely on. But if you hold it there long enough, it should, yep, looks like it's, yeah, it's good. Okay. So I got that little excess wire hanging off. I'm just gonna take the snips, and you could just use scissors for that, it's so thin. And look at that. We have a 90% completed circuit. Taking this wire, stripping off the end, feeding it through the one hole here. Oops. Feeding it through the one hole here like this. And I solder in place on the back. And like I said, if you accidentally mess it up and you don't have appropriately sized wires, you can just bend it around and then solder it directly to the back instead of through the hole like I showed with the other coil. Now, I need to take this and wrap it around. Some people might wrap it around twice, but you wouldn't have enough length for this, so wrap it around once, trying to keep it pretty tight to the coil, and then approximating how much wire you'll need to solder into this hole. So it looks like I'll probably need about this much. So I'm going to take this, and cut it, now unwind it so I don't actually put any pressure on the secondary coil. I'm going to strip it using my teeth, which is the best wire stripper. I don't really recommend that, but I do it a lot. And then, you know what, that's a little too loose for my taste. Ho 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 ho, funny. So I'm gonna cut off. Like I said, technically speaking, the closer you are to this coil here, the more induced current you should theoretically get. So I'm gonna, that's much better. Okay, I think that is livable. Sorry about the bad view. I'm trying to push the wire through and hold it in place. Well, it gets very hot while soldering at the same time. Okay. And we should, in theory, have a completed desktop Tesla coil. Cut off extra the wire there. Rid of that hot glue that somehow got over there. Tesla coil feels solid in place. We got the primary coil. And one thing to do right now is, even if you made sure you lined it up before, is just to check once again that the transistors are on the right side. So BD, BD, and then the P7, P7, I can see that they're on the right side, because if you start this up and they're not on the right sides, it's very possible you might destroy the circuit. So it's always a good idea to double check. Last thing we're going to do is just put on these standoffs, which are simple as just feeding a screw through here, like so, holding it, and then just twisting them on by finger while supporting the top, holding it in place. Do that for all the sides. And there you can see the standoffs being pretty nice, actually. I'm glad that they included that, because they could have got away with not including that. But the thing that's good about it is it means that you're not going to, if you put this on like a metal surface, you're not going to have your lead shorting out. It stands it up enough that these don't contact, the bottom of the circuit doesn't contact anything. So it's actually pretty dang nice that they end up doing that. So this is the completed circuit. Now I want to tell you a funny story before I plug this in and try it out. If you look on here, it says DC 005, right? Let's zoom in here. DC 005. So you might assume that means the power supply is 5 volts. I know that's what I assumed. And you know what happened? I spent an hour trying to figure out why in the hell this thing wouldn't work. I plugged in a 5-volt power supply, I plugged in a 6-volt power supply, I tried making it run off a USB, because if it's 5 volts, why not having a battery-powered Tesla coil, am I right? I mounted USB connections to the bottom here, plugged it in, checked all the parts, could not figure out why in the world it wouldn't run. And the reason is because it's not 5 volts. I don't know why in the world they have DC 005. It actually is, and I only found this out after looking at the eBay listing, between it's between 18 and 24 volts. So a lot of time wasted trying to figure out why in the world this thing wouldn't work. A ridiculously absurd amount of time just idiotically wasted on my part. Now, before turning this thing on the first time, what I recommend doing is with this little stray wire here, is either taking sandpaper and sanding it a little bit, or the simpler way, taking a lighter and just heating it up slightly, and this will burn off the insulating barrier. So, what I have here is I have a Toshiba. I work on computers, I salvage them for parts and all other different stuff, and including laptops, so I have a lot of spare laptop power supplies around. This is a 19 volt, 3.95 amp laptop charger, and I think it should work perfectly for this application, especially seeing as the head is the perfect size to fit right in here, like so. One thing to keep in mind is you have to make sure your polarity is correct on the charger. I used a multimeter to verify, but this specifically needs to have the right polarity. A lot of times it's marked on the power supplies. This specific one, it does not seem to be, but the inside, the hole that the prong plugs into, needs to be positive in this specific circuit, and the outside needs to be negative, which it is. So I plug it in like this, I take my power supply, and let's see, moment of truth, will it work? That's strange. Apparently, no, it will not work. We see that all the LEDs are lighting up. Let's try and unplug it. And plug it back in, and nothing's happening because apparently the transistor doesn't seem to be firing. Oh, you know what? I idiotically missed, or I didn't properly solder all the way this lead. Let me show you my mistake there. This is why it's always good to double check. I've been mainly watching what I've been doing through the camera, so it's a little bit hard to see, but this lead was missed. So I'm just gonna hit that with the soldering iron real quick, which of course I already unplugged, so it should probably cool off by now. Plug that back in. Give that a touch of solder. Also, while I'm doing this, I'm going to look to see if I can see any other ones that I may have missed or improperly soldered, and the rest of them look good. So, try 2. Let's see if this works. All right, all right, all right. Where is the... Oh, for shame, for shame. What have you done? So looking at the back, there are no improperly soldered components. Everything else was checked very thoroughly during the soldering process, yet I'm not seeing any type of discharge. I'm feeling this one transistor get hot. Other than that, I'm not seeing anything. I guess what I'm going to do is try and resolder every lead. So I'll be back here in a few. So I resoldered all the connections, and I keep plugging it in, and nothing happens. I'm getting a hot transistor on one of these signs, but I'm not seeing any electrical arcing or anything like that. And the only thing I can possibly see, and if it is the case, it's my mistake, but it's also kind of their mistake for not providing instructions and specifically pointing this out. What I'm figuring is I seem to have done almost 2 coils around this secondary versus this one that I've only done one really tight one. So I'm figuring maybe the problem is that I have almost 2 coils, because once again, it's in proportion to the amount of rotation. So if it goes around once, then it should multiply by a factor of 1-to-1 ratio. But if it's around twice, then it's only 50% multiplication to the secondary coil. So I'm gonna cut this, I'm gonna rewrap and make sure I only get a single wrap like this, and we'll see if that changes the outcome. And if so, it's actually good that I did this, because it's probably something that many other people might do too, and it's useful just to know that that could potentially be a problem. But I'm speaking too soon. I don't even know if that's the issue, so let's try it. So the way I'm going to achieve this lesser wrapping is by switching the direction in which I have put the wire on. So instead of going around this way, where you can see it wraps almost double for a big section of the coil, we're going to go from the inside instead and go this way. And you can see how much extra wire we have, because it is not having to almost wrap around twice. So let's see if this changes anything. Alright, the moment of truth. I've changed the way that it's wrapped around, so that way it should pretty much just be a single time, and we'll see if it works. Plugging in now. Ow! Whoa, I definitely got shocked by something, so that's why you should probably wait to plug in. But yes, it is working, if you can see that. So, like I said, very good thing that I ran across this problem, because now if anyone else runs across a similar problem, hopefully they will be able to get a solution based off of what happened in this video. So you can see, and it's going to be a little bit hard to focus on, but there is in fact a electrical discharge there. Do I have anything black around here? Keep electronics away from this, by the way, unless you want them fried. So yeah, you can see that discharge. I'll try and get a little bit better shot when I can. Now, one thing that's kind of weird about this is that when you get, and these things are already cooking, these heat sinks here, is when you get too close to it, it will actually go out. And then a lot of times, well, this one's actually working better than the other one. This one's actually coming back on. The other one will turn off and it won't come back on. This one actually is coming back on. Yes. Okay. The thing that's kind of cool about this is if you take something like, for example, this fluorescent bulb, and you bring it just close, so you can see nothing attached to the base. You bring it close to the electrical arc, which I really wish you could see better. Maybe if I turn off the lights here. And you bring a fluorescent light close to it, it'll actually energize the light, cause it to turn on. Yeah, so look at that. Wireless energy. Pretty neat. I haven't had luck getting, because this is a pretty low powered one. I haven't had luck getting any other cooler discharging effects using like regular light bulbs or LEDs or anything like. If I bring an LED light close to it, it does nothing. But it definitely works pretty well with the old fluorescent. So this is just a CFL or compact fluorescent light. So yeah, like I said, these transistors are already cooking. This will actually melt the glue that's mounting the coil here. I'm going to use this thermal infrared thermometer, take the temperature, and this one on this side right here is 257 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 258 degrees, which is 125.5 degrees Celsius. This other side here is about 150 or 65.5 degrees Celsius. So yeah, these things really do cook. And could you imagine what would happen if you didn't even use thermal paste between that and the heatsink? So you can get cheap Tesla coils. One of the things that make this Tesla coil specifically more appealing is its supposed ability to play music through the arc. I want to try and get a better demonstration through the discharge. Also, these are significantly different from a Van de Graaff generator, which is using static electricity, and the fact that a Van de Graaff generator puts out DC current, and this is actually an AC discharge. But yeah, this is supposed to be able to play music. Now, I'm not seeing really any good protection in this circuit, so it's very much possible that if you try and do something like plug this into your phone or your MP3 player or something, that it could backfire and I don't know, potentially destroy your socket or your entire phone. And I would never recommend plugging your phone or any valuable electronic devices into this. If you want to play music through it to show your friends, I would suggest getting a cheap MP3 player that you don't mind getting destroyed. But because I don't have one of those on hand and I am an idiot, I am going to plug it directly into my $130 phone. Okay. Let's see if I go to YouTube Music Library. I actually notice sometimes when when I go to do stuff with this plugged into my phone will act a little bit funny. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's putting back a little bit of juice through the headphone jack and making weird things happen. Yeah, like for example, I just tried typing in YouTube Music Library and all of a sudden it opens up a random page instead of doing the Google search like I wanted it to. YouTube Music. Alright, so I got a song from the YouTube Music Library. This is Never Sleep by Gunnar Oslin, and I'm going to play it. Now this is being played, there's no speakers involved. This is being played just through the discharge of this Tesla coil. And I can actually prove this. So you've seen that there was no speakers in the components. Should hopefully be able to hear the sound move around with the coil. But also, if I were to touch this discharge, like so, as I get close to it, you can hear it fade out and even stop. And like I said, it is the discharge and somewhat the oscillation of the coil itself. This discharge is hot enough to melt stuff and catch stuff on fire, by the way. For example, this plastic bag, if I can see, it cuts through it. Which also, when I touch it with my finger, it doesn't really hurt, but you can see smoke come off my hand sometimes, like right there, because it actually will burn your finger slightly. I can't tell you what the voltage of this discharge is, but it is at least decently high. For a $5 little soldering kit you assemble yourself, this thing really isn't too bad sounding, even using the audio function, for class demonstrations or for showing something cool to your friend. But like I said, once again, I'd worry about using this with any of your very expensive electronic devices because something very bad could happen if something bad happens to the circuit. I'd also like to point out that I'm using a 19-volt power supply, and this thing's supposed to use up to a 24-volt. I honestly think with how hot this transistor is, it was 310 degrees Fahrenheit last time I measured it, that if you used a 24-volt power supply, it would probably burn out really, really quick, and this might even burn out really, really quick at its current going rate. At least right now, where it doesn't have a fan or anything like that mounted to help carry excess heat. So I'm going to try and mount a fan on there and hopefully keep this thing much, much cooler. So I already showed you that with the fluorescent tubes, you can like light up stuff and transfer energy wirelessly, which is pretty neat. But if I were to take something like an LED and I were to just, if I touch it, it sometimes does stuff, sometimes doesn't. It's not very reliable, and it hardly even lights. However, if I were to take a coil, so too lazy to actually make a regular coil right now for this, I just have a spool of wire that I use. One end connected here, one end connected here, just acting as a very basic coil. And if I were to attach one side to one lead of my LED, and the other side to my other lead of the LED, and if I bring this spool of wire now close to this discharge, you will see that, it'll light up. Ooh, or maybe not. I think I might have burned it out when I touched it directly to the arc. No matter though, I have plenty more LEDs where that came from. So I've got the same thing. I'll take a new LED. Now if I bring it close, you can see that wirelessly we are transferring electricity or energy to this LED here. The coil orientation actually affects it. I think we might have damaged our LED now. Getting a little too close. So, yeah, that's kind of a neat little thing. The LED doesn't want to really light up much now. Oh, there we go. Now it's lighting up again. Okay. Well, whatever. Yeah, we're transferring energy wirelessly. You could make a little tiny coil and attach it to the LED and achieve basically this effect. It seems very sporadic. I don't know what exactly plays into the specific factors. You know, like for example, it's not even attached to a coil now, it's just a wire, and by holding it like this, we're not getting almost anything, but if I take it and I wrap it around the discharge in a very specific way, it works like mad. So, like, I don't know, it's really weird. Like I said, I don't know a huge amount about Tesla coils, but I guess this would kind of make sense because it's a circular sort of field being generated anyways. But yeah. Oops. Causing my phone to bug out again. Should be noted that is it this coil? Okay. Seems like wrapping it around the coil does much better. That makes sense. So less about the discharge and more about the coil seems to be doing stuff. This LED lead is getting pretty hot because apparently there's a lot of juice being pushed through it. But yeah, just the LED by itself, by the coil, does not a zip zilch. So, is it worth it? Should you run out and buy one of these kits and assemble it yourself? Do I think it's worth it? Yeah, I actually do. Why does the... Okay. Yeah, I actually think it is. I think that for $5, you get a cool sort of demonstrational piece that can even play music, though I wouldn't recommend using anything valuable with the audio jack, because you don't want it to get destroyed. overall, it's just as kind of a neat thing to play around with. Like I said, can make for very good demonstrations for classes or different things like that. And yeah, I think overall it's worth $5, and it's also worth the experience. It's just that if you have a power supply, picking up I think they recommend an 18 through 24 volts 3 amp power supply, that may be a little bit costly in certain circumstances, and you should factor that into whatever price you are going to be paying. Ooh. Oh, that was a little piece of solder. I was a little bit worried. You gotta be, like I said, very careful about this coil too with, yeah, so actually the size of the coil work the best, it looks like. You have to be very careful with this coil, getting it close to other electronic devices. For example, if I put my camera too close to this thing right now, I could potentially destroy my camera, as it might induce current inside of it and fry electronic parts or corrupt data, especially anything that has coils or chokes or anything like that, which are technically coils in them, can have a voltage induced in it quite easily and potentially really mess up stuff, which almost everything nowadays has coils or chokes in them and all the different types of stuff. And yeah, it probably wouldn't be very, very good, and you probably don't want your stuff fried. So $5. Neat little thing for the price, I gotta say. Can I get... No, still not enough juice to excite this LED's circuit, or maybe the circuit is just not one that's very responsive, because you can get it to work with LEDs, but they will have to have a certain circuit type to function properly. Okay guys, well anyways, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it informational, useful. If you want to buy one of these circuits yourself to assemble, I will leave a link to eBay in the description below. That'll allow you to hopefully find one for just as cheap, and hopefully the same one if it works. So far I've assembled 2 of them and they both actually work. This one works better though. Like the other one will just, if I touch it and it sort of draws too much current, it will just shut off. This one will come back on after a second. So thank you very much to my patrons who support the production of new videos with their very generous donations. I appreciate that. Ow. A lot. That's a burnt my finger. I appreciate that a lot, and ask that if you guys want to continue to support, you do so, and that anyone that is interested in starting to support, check out the Patreon link in the description below. Thank you guys very much for watching. Please drop a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and, well, in general, bye.